Hello, hello. Welcome to Your Home by Design, the podcast where we talk all about our homes and how they affect our health and well-being. Some episodes we delve deep into the research and some we just chat. I'm Nico, an interior designer and researcher passionate about bringing forward the findings so that you can improve your lifestyle and well-being. Grateful to have you. Let's do this. Have you ever thought about how much space you need in your home? Distances for things, to know if certain furniture fits. Have you ever felt crammed in a room? This can be getting out of your chair at the dinner table, or it feeling tight while you're doing dishes at the sink, having to squeeze behind something to get to something else, causing all sorts of frustrations. And you might not even know that these dimensions can impact how you use or not use your space. There are standard dimensions that you must consider in order to move freely through your home and to use your rooms for how you really need them to be used. There is a science to this and some pretty important reasons why we all need to use and know these standard dimensions. If you know these, then you know if that sofa is going to fit before you bring it home. Welcome to today's episode on standard dimensions. So what are standard dimensions and why do we need them? And how the heck did we come to realize that there were a set of dimensions that we all work best within? Well, let's get into it. Standard dimensions are a huge part of creating a comfortable home. When you go to a store and you're looking for a new dining table, do you ever bust out a tape measure to make sure the dining table will work to eat at? Chances are you don't. You know the design is for dining, so you don't tend to question if it's going to work to eat at. Dining tables do vary slightly in terms of heights, which we'll go over later in the episode, but there is a standard range of dimensions for dining tables. Standard dimensions can be seen in all sorts of things in interior design. Furniture has standard dimensions, like seat heights for sofas and dining chairs. Coffee and side table heights, sofa arm heights for modern styles versus traditional, desk heights. There's also standard dimensions for floor plans like hallway widths, toilet and shower clearances. And I'm sure you're well aware of some of these, like spatial needs for walking around your coffee table comfortably. The square footage you need for a comfortable dining room to accommodate the standard dimensions for pulling out a dining chair and if somebody is to walk behind you when you're sitting at that chair. In kitchens, you have standard counter heights and island widths and counter stools or bar stool heights. You have standard dimensions for either sides of your sink or your cooktop. You get the picture, right? There are endless standard dimensions. But have you ever wondered how we came to understand the dimensions for these? No doubt this question has absolutely kept you up at night, right? No, but seriously, have you ever thought about how we landed on these sorts of standard dimensions? Well, let me tell you, this is based on anthropometrics. I'm going to say that again, just because it's a hard one. This is based on anthropometrics, which is the study of human body measurement. So how are standard dimensions determined? Well, a whole bunch of data is compiled on all things like human body size, age, range of joint motion, and all of that data is compiled to inform the relationship between us and how we use our space. Having anthropometric data is essential for designing anything, really. Furniture, cabinetry, planning, circulation spaces, workspaces, accessibility. This is where we get our standard or typical dimensions from. There are two main types of measurements that data is collected from that impact the design of interior space. And that is structural, also called static, and functional. Structural is the actual body measurements like the size of the head and limbs and the width of the body in standard positions. Functional measurements are measurements taken in working positions during the movement associated with certain tasks. So how do these measurements play into how we get standard dimensions? Well, if you factor in the average dimensions of a person in a static position and the average dimensions of movements while in functional positions, then it results in an average dimension or range of dimensions that a person needs to perform a specific task or movement. Now, aren't you happy that there are people that study anthropometric data? Because they just work this all out and tell us what the standard dimensions are. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So that's how we know how much room you need to comfortably eat your Christmas dinner next to Aunt Trudy without bumping elbows while Uncle Jim passes behind you to get another bottle of vino. So here's the thing. Here's how I see standard dimensions. They are a guide to live comfortably and functionally appropriate in a room for your intended use. Knowing standard dimensions and ranges of standard dimensions helps you determine why and where you might choose the lesser range or the greater range. I want you to think about cats for a second, like the furry pets. They have whiskers, right? Well, they have whiskers to determine if they can fit between things. These whiskers provide cats spatial awareness. If they want to go in a hole and their whiskers touch the sides, they may not go in. So I give you this picture because I think we not only have all that data that collects on our range of motion and average sizes, but we also have like an invisible whiskers. We almost have an extension of ourselves, an intuitive ability to sense if something spatially is working for us or not. We don't have whiskers, obviously, but we have this ability to sense if something is working simply by how we move through and use our space. And you can figure this out by paying attention to how you feel in a room and asking yourself a couple questions. So ask yourself several times in a room while doing different things, how do I feel right now? Note your emotion. And am I using this room as I would have hoped? If we don't have enough room for something, then it becomes uncomfortable. So here's a little personal story. My husband used to love to cook. In fact, at one point, he considered going to culinary school. He was always creating the most amazing food. And during this time, we had a really great kitchen. It had a ton of counter space, a really good sized fridge. It was open to the living and dining room, which was obviously great for entertaining. We had a great gas range. And then we moved. He cooked in that kitchen for several years before we moved. And when we moved, where we moved didn't compare in terms of the kitchen. We didn't even chat about this at the time, but as soon as we moved to our new place, he stopped cooking. The kitchen was closed off. There wasn't adequate counter space. The cooktop was really tight to one wall. It was probably one of the most uninspiring and unfunctional kitchens to be in. In fact, I don't think we've ever eaten out as much as we did when we were living in this place. This was not a conscious decision either. This was simply an effect from our spatial needs not being met. He simply felt uncomfortable performing cooking tasks in the kitchen. And when I think back, it reminds me, it brings me back to the analogy of the cat whiskers. He didn't try it and then say, oh, this is not right, or, oh, that's not quite right. And, oh, look, I can't really do this, or I can't do that. It wasn't like he analyzed the space to that degree. He simply just didn't go in. It was like his whiskers said that this is not going to work. So when I say to ask yourself the question of, am I using the room as I would have hoped? This is why. Because if you have spatial needs that aren't being met, then you might not even know. You might not even be aware because you may not have analyzed your standard dimensions. You simply just don't do the things you might do if your spatial needs were being met. Do you see how standard dimensions impacts our lives? If we're not utilizing the information that we have, do you see how important this could be if you're not actually performing a task that might bring you joy or happiness because it's aggravating you and you're getting the sense that the space doesn't fit you well. This is how our spaces can affect us if we don't take this into account. In order to have a home that is suited best to you, then you must consider areas in your home that may be stopping you from living in your home how you want to live. And I know that there are times when the amount of space you need is not what you have, like our kitchen. And perhaps there is nothing you can do about it. But it is really important to know if you don't have standard allowances and standard dimensions, because it will give you insight into how you use the space, how you respond to it intuitively. The areas in your life that are lacking as a result, and you can plan for a change, and you will know where you need more space. And this is an important piece of the puzzle. So knowing if you are lacking space allows you to make changes as well. So for instance, if you know how much space you need for clearances in a dining room, then you can adjust your table size to allow for this. It may mean that you have to go with a narrower table, which will limit the amount of room you have on the table for things like dishes and servingware, which means, you may have to plan to serve and dish out in the kitchen. So you might just have to kind of shuffle some things around, and it may not be ideal, but the most important is to create a room that is comfortable to move around in, whether you're sitting or coming in and going out, especially in rooms that you use often. I would say, really focus on that. Dial down the rooms you use a lot and make sure you have addressed the clearances you need in those rooms, because you want the room to welcome you in and not frustrate you at all when you move through it, and when you use it for the functions that you need. So one of my favorite things to do is rework a floor plan. Look at the current layout of a house and ask, how can this be improved? Looking at the circulation and those standard clearances. Should circulation change? Should the placement of the kitchen move to be more accessible to the main living spaces, or to expand the countertops and to get your work zone the adequate amount of space that you need? Is the living room large enough to accommodate everyone living there comfortably? What size furniture is going to work best for the functions? So I take that into account when I'm reworking a floor plan. It's really about problem solving and going through all the variables and the list of important things based on those standard dimensions and what we really need in order to live in the space comfortably. And I do love a good rework where I get to take down those walls to improve the flow and the square footage and to really customize the space for the client's needs. But even though it is one of my favorite things, often a reno of that scale is not in the scope. And I just want to say that if there isn't a reno to that scope, then there are still so many ways to improve a home to better suit the homeowner and to make sure you're working within those standard dimensions, and getting the right sized furniture is imperative, and getting the right amount of furniture as well is really important. And something I have to mention, because it is equally important, in addition to having oversized furniture or not enough space for standard dimensions, you can also have too small of furniture and too much space, so too much room between things, that it can cause your room to feel really uncomfortable. So for example, if you have your home feels really sparse, and there isn't, say, enough places to put your drink down, or there isn't enough seating to accommodate guests. This can feel very sparse, and it can actually feel very uncomfortable. or let's say your sofa and your coffee table are just under scale. So your room might be able to accommodate larger scale furniture, but your scale is too small. And it might even cause you to have to reach too far to put a glass down and pick it up, where that becomes physically uncomfortable. So this is also very important. So I'm going to run through some really quick areas for standard dimensions. But just so you know, standard dimensions are available anytime. Like all you have to do is Google them. So the next time you're buying a dining table, you want to make sure you're buying the right size for your room to allow for those standard dimensions. And if you're working with, say, a builder, you want to just double check those plans to ensure that they haven't or that they've taken into account those crucial dimensions, because as you'll find out as I run through some areas for standard dimensions, there is going to be a range, and often that range is dependent on your size. If you're a tall person, then you might want to go on the higher side of the standard dimensions, or if you're a shorter person, you might want to go with the lower size. And I just want to reiterate here that our homes, I think oftentimes people are scared to do something that's kind of out of a normal range. So let's say you're like, oh, I know that the countertops are 36 inches high. Well, there is a range there. You could actually go slightly under that or slightly over that, and that depends on your height. And so I just want to challenge you here to not feel that you have to stick to something that everyone says, no, this is what you do. You have to factor in your size, your family size, what functions you're trying to do. There's times where if you really enjoy cooking and you want your island to be a place that you prep food, you might want your island to actually be a little bit higher than the rest of your countertops. This is completely okay. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, let's have like a 4 or 6 inch difference. It might be an inch. It could be 2 inches. But that's something that I want you to feel confident to explore, because ultimately it's these kind of decisions that are going to make your home the best for you. So anyway, I am going to go over the first one I'm going to talk about is kitchens. And I know I've just kind of rambled a bit there and shared a bit of those standard dimensions, but I'll reiterate them as we move forward. So as I've said, there is a range of standard dimensions. So I'm going to run through some areas. I'm going to share some of those standard dimensions. I'll run through the kitchen, some of that I've already mentioned, but I'll add to that. And then furniture spacing, and in that I'll include some really key dining room measurements, and bathroom. This one is very, very important. Okay, so first up, the kitchen. So as I've already mentioned, the standard countertop height is 36 inches, and this works for the average height, but that can go higher or lower. It can be changed. I'm an average height, and I prefer a 37-inch countertop. I'm just over 5'6". So a 37-inch countertop is perfect for me. And I also prefer a 38 to 39-inch island height. So countertop height typically can go as low as 34. It can go a little bit lower, but let's just 34, or as high as 40 inches. But typically, say 35 to 36 is a great height for the average person, and 38 inches is great for taller people. And if you're designing for accessibility, then this will be on the lower side, and that's crucial for being able to move and use the kitchen without any constraints. And something to keep in mind is if you do change the height of your counter, whether that's lowering it or raising it, is how this will affect the cabinetry. Because if you're having custom cabinetry built, and this could affect the boxes, right? So a lot of cabinet companies, you might have custom elements to it, but their boxes are standard sizing. So if you're raising the height of your countertop, then they're going to have to adjust their cabinet box sizes, and that will drive the price. So just be mindful of this, and you have to weigh this. This is always about, if 36 works and that's the standard height, and that's going to keep you in budget, because that's going to mean you're not having to alter those boxes. And if that works for you, then great. But if it's ideal for you to have a 38-inch high counter, it might be worth bumping up the price a little bit in order to get really, really what you want and what you need. And the other thing I will say is that taller cabinets actually make a space feel a little bit grander. So just food for thought there. So in a kitchen, it's so important to have adequate space for the tasks you perform. So if you have a work zone, so where you're prepping your veg, and it's in between, say, your fridge and your sink, then you're going to need about 42 inches. And if you're walking through a kitchen and you're carrying a dish of potatoes, you need 24 inches. This is called a circulation zone. So this is where you're coming in and going out. And this space is meant to be clear. This is not shared with another task like opening up an oven or sitting at an island. And so there are so many more standard dimensions for kitchens, like the proper island pendant light, the placement of the light off of the top of the countertop, and countertop seat height and upper cabinet reach height. But I'm not going to list all of them here today. We don't have the time. And I think it's pretty easy for you to get that information if you Google it. But I would say, just to make sure, if you're in the middle of designing your kitchen, or if you're evaluating how your kitchen's working for you, make sure you go through all of those standard dimensions. It's quite easy to just Google the list of standard dimensions for kitchen design. So make sure you do that. Okay, so the next one, I'm just going to run through some furniture spacing. I'm just going to focus on sofas and the space that you need for between your coffee table and your sofa edge. So for your sofa, you need between 26 and 28 inches where you sit. So where you plant your bum, the actual cushion underneath you, that's like what your body requires. But I would say that's a minimum, right? So most actual sofa cushions aren't going to be that small. You're going to see larger, maybe a 30-inch to a 36 and even more. But that depends on the scale of the sofa. But yeah, I would say it is between 26 and 28, but I always, increase that one a little bit. But the length of your sofa, so for 3 women, the overall length of your sofa, so this is including the arms, it should be between 80 and 90 inches. And for men, it should be between 90 and 96 inches. The length of a love seat for women should be between 58 and 64 inches and 62 to 68 for men. But of course, you have to always understand that, let's say you're like, in a perfect world, I need a sofa that's going to accommodate 3 grown men. Okay, well, you might need 96 inches, whereas you might not have a space that can accommodate a 96-inch sofa. And if that's the case, then you have to just say, well, what else can I do here? Can I get a 2-seater sofa here that's each cushion is wide enough to accommodate 2 grown men, and then you get a chair, an occasional chair that's also large enough to accommodate a grown man. So you've got to get creative in other areas, or maybe you don't even, maybe that's just once a year that you need a larger sofa. So it doesn't make sense for you to cram that into your room and risk cutting off circulation areas and for the room to not feel as good as it could, versus just getting one that's appropriate for the square footage that you have. So the next one is your coffee table. This one's an important one. So from the edge of your sofa to the edge of the coffee table, there should be at least 16 to 18 inches. Okay. And the height of your coffee table should be the height of your sofa seat in order for it to feel comfortable and to scale. So, you can vary this slightly. I would say, you could go 1 to 2 inches lower than your seat height or higher, but I would say 1 inch higher is better than 2. And the length of the coffee table should be roughly 2/3 the length of your sofa, like give or take. So if you go with, say, an 84-inch sofa, the overall length of your sofa, then you should have a 56-inch coffee table. Okay, so this is important for the function, for you to feel comfortable, and for the scale of the room. Okay, so now I'm going to just run through some dining room measurements. And to start, a little rule of thumb is you should have the same number of seats at the dining table as you do in the living room, okay? So this is for entertaining. So think about being a guest and sitting down at the table and then moving to the living room or the great room or the family room, wherever you're going to move after to relax and have a drink. And there isn't enough places to sit, right? I mean, this can be awkward, especially for the host who's kind of scrambling to kind of figure out where everybody's going to sit. But this can be easily done with occasional chairs or like an ottoman, like a little ottoman if you have one. Okay, so just remember that you have to think about this ahead of time. The amount of people at the dinner table, there should be a place for everyone to sit wherever you move to after dinner, okay? Okay, so now when you're sitting at the table, how much space does a person need on the table? Okay, so this is important if you're trying to work out what size table you want to buy. Okay, so you need to first determine how many people you want to sit at the table and then work out the space that every person needs at the table. So 24 inches from side to side, and then 18 inches from the edge of the table to like from front to back. That's how much space a person needs to sit and eat comfortably, okay? And then to actually sit, the space from the edge of the table to behind your chair, you need between 18 to 24 inches. And this is just for sitting. This isn't moving in and out, which you do at the dining table. So you need 30 to 36 inches to move your chair in and out comfortably. And if you have a wall behind you, so say your dining room is completely enclosed, you then need 36 to 42 inches from the edge of the table to that wall. And if you're sitting and somebody's going to actually pass behind you, so there's a circulation zone behind you, then you need 48 inches from the edge of the table for that clearance. Okay, so and now for table size. So the ideal table size in a perfect world is 54 inches by 96. And this is for 6 adults to sit comfortably with all of the clearances taken into account. So this is the area in the middle where all the serving dishes are, or, you know, our floral arrangements and vases or whatever it is, right? You've got this spot in the middle that is like a communal area. And then each person has that 24 by 18. So this is a really comfortable table. It's 54 by 96, right? My table is 44 by 86. And I would say, in all honesty, my table is not wide enough. But this is the table that works in our space. We use this regularly. We don't have a separate dining or breakfast nook or anything. This is our table. It's hard wearing. It's open plan. So the 44 by 86 is what works. This is 6 people sit at this comfortably. But I do find that I would love to increase that width. It's just not wide enough to get dishes, serving dishes and lots of, you know, things on the table. So I have to think through that. And that for me is something simple as we just have to make it really informal at times. And we're serving on the island and that kind of thing, which is cool. I don't mind that. But, you know, anyway, so yeah, that's what fits in my space. I do have a leaf that I add into it to get more people around the table. And I can get up to 10, which is great. For us, that's perfect. Anyway, so just keep that in mind that when I say like the ideal size of a dining table is 54 by 96, yes, that's in a perfect world. But if you don't have the space to accommodate that, don't cram it in, because there's nothing worse than saying, yes, I've got the size that's perfect, but nobody can move around comfortably. Okay, so that you have to factor everything in and really find what works for you. And of course, you know, whether you're doing informal or formal dining, right? If it's an informal table, it can be smaller. Okay. So, and you can go as small as say like a round breakfast table, which could be between 36 and 42 inches. Okay. The next thing, and I'm just going to run through this one pretty quick. The bathroom. Okay. So some important dimensions for the bathroom. The counter height. The counter height is very important. And, if you were to walk into a house that was built, 20 years ago, let's say, you're going to see a different counter height than you would now. Okay. The counter heights have increased, which I think is amazing because it's just so much more functional. And the same thing in a small space, when you bring that counter height up, it actually gives impact to the space, and it actually makes the space feel more grand. Just like I mentioned in the kitchen, this is also the case for the bathroom. Okay. So the standard height for a bathroom for females is between 32 and 36 inches. 32 is crazy low, in my opinion, but that's just kind of like ergonomically what works for females. And then for males, it's between 37 and 43. Okay. I find this funny because you don't often see two different sink heights in a bathroom. They're usually consistent. So that's usually where we get the like 36 to 37 inch height, to average it out and for everyone to feel all right. So 36 to 37, I think, is a great height. You can go higher, you can go lower, but again, this is personal. So it's best to test this for yourself and to take into account your heights, right? If you're living in a family and this is a shared bathroom and you've got children, well, children grow, so you can't design necessarily for their heights now. Or you might have a really tall male in the house, and then you've got an average height female, right? Like you have to kind of average that out and just see how it feels. So, but rule of thumb, I would say, is just to stay safe in this and do the 36 to 37, but always test it out. Go take your tape measure, around with you for a few months. And if you go into a restaurant, measure it. If you go into a hotel, measure it. If you go to a friend's house, measure it. Really, really try to get a sense of what height you like and how it looks in the space, how it reads. As I mentioned, pay attention to those taller heights because it's going to make it feel more grand. Okay. So the next thing I would say is the circulation behind a sink should be between about 30 inches. So that's if you're standing at the sink, if you're going to wash your face or brush your teeth or whatever, you need to feel comfortably 30 inches. And your toilet needs 30 inches of space. So for you to sit on the toilet, that width of space needs to be about 30 inches minimum, I would say. Don't make this too big because that's not going to work either. But the rule of thumb is 15 inches to center on both sides. Okay. And if you make this any less, please don't make it any less, because if you do run the risk of it feeling really, really crammed. But one thing I will say is that in places like powder rooms where you just don't have the square footage and you are kind of cramming things in, this would be one area where I guess not ideal at all, but more acceptable to have less space. So I leave you with this. If you create your home to make it the most comfortable for what you need, you have done what anthropometrics, standard dimensions, were created to do. And that's to have your home work for your needs and to suit your needs. You don't want to have to change for your home. We carve out our homes and spaces to work for us, not the other way around. And last thing I'll say, it's to pay attention to people in your home. Pay attention, okay? It will be obvious if they are uncomfortable. Like standing instead of sitting might mean you don't have enough options for comfortable seating. Holding a drink instead of placing it down or sitting upright and rigid in their chair may mean your coffee table is too far away. So I always say, pay attention. Be an observer in your home. Your emotions and your actions, as well as the emotions and actions of your guests, will guide you to where you need to utilize those standard dimensions. Thank you for listening to today's episode.